Bonjour! The GCSE French speaking exam is 25% of your total grade, and last year I got almost full marks for my written exam, and now I'm doing A-Level French. So in this video, I'll give you my top tips to smash the roleplay, photocard, and the general conversation. On y va? So the speaking exam consists of 3 parts. The first is the roleplay, and with AQA this lasts for around 2 minutes, and is marked out of 15. The next section is the photocard, which takes 3 minutes and is another 15 marks. The final section is the scary general conversation, lasting 5 to 7 minutes at higher tier and accounts for the last 30 marks, so in total it's out of 60. Now, before you get into the exam, you have 12 minutes to prepare for your roleplay and your photocard. Personally, I'd not spend longer than maybe 2 or 3 minutes in the roleplay, as this only requires really short answers. Try to spend as much time as possible on the photocard, as this requires longer, more developed answers. So I try to write maybe 3 sentences for the photocard questions, as this means you can get away with slightly shorter answers for the 2 unprepared questions you'll be given in this section. Let's focus on the roleplay and how you can achieve full marks in this section. So, in the mark scheme, 10 marks are awarded for communication and 5 marks for your knowledge and use of language. In order to make sure you get these marks, you want your answers to be short and clear, because not only does this ensure the ideas are conveyed without ambiguity, but it also means that you're less likely to make mistakes. So, for example, if the roleplay is in a bakery and the examiner asks what you would like, a simple "Je voudrais une baguette" is a perfect answer. In order to get 5 out of 5 for grammar, your verbs need to always be accurate. So therefore, I'd avoid using complicated tenses such as the conditional, apart from maybe je voudrais, and stick to basic sentences such as j'aime la pizza or je n'aime pas le foot. At some point in your roleplay, you'll need to ask a question, and I think the most simple way is to use est-ce que. Now, if you don't know what est-ce que means, it's essentially just a phrase that you can put in front of any statement to turn it into a question. It literally means, is it that? So it does kind of work the same in English. But for example, tu aimes le foot means you like football, and est-ce que tu aimes le foot means do you like football? Now, let's move on to the photocard. This will consist of 3 questions that you're given during your preparation time, and the first one is always qu'est-ce qu'il y a sur la photo, as well as 2 unprepared questions. The top band of the mark scheme states that you have to develop most answers, and this means you need to develop at least 3 answers. So therefore, try to make sure the answers you prepare for are as developed as possible, because this means you can get with slightly less developed answers for the unprepared questions, but I would still try to develop them as much as you can. To make sure your answers are developed, try to use complex structures and multiple sentences. For example, in the question we actually did describe the photo, instead of saying just je peux voir un nom qui semble content, which is still fairly complex, say something like je peux voir un nom qui semble non seulement content, mais aussi joyeux. And this means the non seulement mais aussi means not only, but also. And by adding this phrase, it just adds complexity and helps your answer feel developed. And other really good phrases are d'une part, d'autre part. So, d'une part c'est bon, mais d'autre part c'est cher. So that means on one hand, on the other hand. So the example I gave, d'une part c'est bon, on one hand it's good, d'autre part c'est cher, but on the other hand it's expensive. Also, en plus, furthermore, bear in mind I said en plus, not en plus, but it probably doesn't matter too much in the grand scheme of things. And in the question where you describe the photo, don't just start your sentences with sur la photo il y a, but maybe also use je peux voir, I can see, or maybe even c'est situé, which means it's situated or it's located. And finally, just make sure you include an opinion and a reason, as this is required by the top band. A simple way of making sure you have a reason is by using parce que or car, which means because, maybe even puisque, which means like since or because, or even like à cause de, grâce à, which means because of. To introduce your opinions, saying phrases like je dirais que or je trouve que are more interesting than just using à mon avis or je pense que. So that will just help you stand out. And for the unprepared questions, make sure you answer both of them, and do not be afraid to ask your teacher to repeat the question. You will not drop any marks for that as long as you ask it in French. So, est-ce que tu peux répéter or est-ce que vous pouvez répéter? Alors, and now we have the dreaded general conversation. And I know this sounds terrifying, but I promise it is nowhere near as scary as it seems at first. And if you prepare really well, you might even find that it's the section you're most confident in before you start your exam. So your school should have given you questions for the general conversation, and you will have selected one theme that is guaranteed to come up. This theme won't come up in your photo card, so I'd recommend choosing the hardest theme. That way you can just memorise the answers and not have to worry about kind of an awful question coming up in the photo card. You'll also be asked questions from one of the other two themes that you study, and this will be whichever theme you don't get in your photo card. Remember that for AQA, theme 1 is identity and culture, theme 2 is local, national, international, global areas of interest, and theme 3 is current and future, study and employment. So, whilst I would recommend trying to memorise your answers to all the questions, it's important to make sure you aren't reliant on this, as you don't want to freeze on the spot if you can't remember exactly what you've written down on the flashcards. And also, if you look at the mark scheme, it's clear that it's important to not just robotically repeat your memorised answers, because you need to sound fluent and spontaneous. So what should you include in your answer? Now, the mark scheme requires a wide variety of linguistic structures and a wide range of vocabulary, as well as confidence in the past, present, and future tenses. Essentially, these answers are just your chance to show off everything you know. So it's really important you include complex structures, such as the conditional, and you try not to repeat yourself. A really key thing is just to avoid repeating parce que over and over again. You can say parce que for because, but also use puisque, car, as these also mean because. Now, let's take a look at some sample questions and answers, and I'll explain what it is about these answers that enable them to achieve top marks. So, we've got qu'est-ce que tu fais pendant ton temps libre? So, même si j'aimerais rencontrer mes amis, pendant mon temps libre, je dois faire mes études à cause de mes examens. Ça m'énerve puisque mes amis n'étudient jamais. So, how does this answer fit into the mark scheme? Well, I've immediately started with même si, and this means although, and this automatically creates a more complex sentence structure. You could, if you're confident with the subjunctive, also use bien que, but I would avoid using this unless you're confident, just because the subjunctive is not required for top marks, so it's better to avoid it unless you're really strong. I've also used the conditional, which I think is a key way of showing you have a really strong grasp on complex grammar. And if you're unsure on how to use this, there's a video on this channel explaining how to form every tense you need to know for GCSE. So the next question we've got, est-ce que tu préférerais voyager en avion ou en bateau? So we've got the conditional there for préférerais, and that's, would you prefer to travel in a plane or in a boat? So, alors, d'une part, j'aime voyager en avion, car c'est plus vite que voyager en train. Pourtant, d'autre part, je préfère voyager en train parce que je voudrais protéger l'environnement. En plus, en voyageant en train, je peux économiser de l'argent. Now, with this example, I've immediately started with the d'une part, d'autre part that I talked about earlier. I'd always try to use this at least once in these kind of questions because it allows you to develop your answer whilst also showing that you know how to use fairly complex grammar. And I've deliberately used pourtant instead of cependant. This also means however, but it's just more sophisticated. And I've used the present participle with en voyageant, which means by travelling or while travelling, but in this context, by travelling. And the last question we've got, quelle est ta matière préférée? And that means, what is your favourite subject? So I've said, quand j'étais plus jeune, j'adorais le théâtre car je l'ai trouvé très divertissant. Mais maintenant, je trouve que c'est assez pénible. En ce moment, je dirais que ma matière préférée, c'est la musique, puisque j'adore jouer du piano. Now, with this question, notice how I didn't answer the question straight away. I gave some context. I talked about what used to be my favourite subject. And not only does this allow me to use more words and therefore show off my wide vocabulary, it also meant that I can prove I'm confident in the past tense, and I actually use the imparfait. And something I'd always recommend is je l'ai trouvé. That means I found it, and it's a great alternative to je pense que or selon moi. And I've also used puisque instead of parce que, as this just allows me to avoid repetition. And in your general conversation, you need to ask a question. And the easiest way to do this is just a simple et toi or et vous, which just mean and you. And you can add this on to the end of one of your answers. I do this in the first few questions personally, just to make sure you don't forget or run out of time, because otherwise you won't be able to get full marks. So what should you be doing the night before? You'll probably be stressed, which is quite understandable. For most people, this is their first GCSE exam, and whilst some stress can be good, just try to calm down and relax. Make sure you know the time and the place of your exam, and which theme you've selected for the general conversation. Once in the exam, talk slowly and clearly, and don't get too worried if you make a mistake, because that will just set you up badly for the rest of your exam. Just try and move on unless you've corrected it immediately. And a lot of mistakes, remember, even around gender, are only considered minor errors. So don't just come out the exam thinking, oh, I've done awfully, because you might not even lost any marks for them. And overall, it's just important to think clearly and make sure you're speaking in the right tense. And if you can, try to relax. So that's all the tips I have for the speaking exam. If you'd like to book a mock lesson to practice your speaking, you can do that on www.asrfrench.com. Subscribe for more GCSE French videos. Good luck and au revoir.